Hello to everyone, greetings to all. My name is Margarita Krisaki and I'm delighted to welcome you to the sixth webinar on education and training in the space sector. For those who may not be familiar with our mission, NEREUS is a space organization that explores the advantages of space technologies for European regions and their citizens. And of course, we also try to we encourage the use of space and its applications. As a result of our extensive academic and research community, both within but also outside our network, education training is one of our key priorities of our organization, and this is reflected, of course, in our activities such as these digital info sessions. Nonetheless, it has been decided during the first year that this series will be accessible to everyone. However, we would need to limit the access gradually to our members exclusively. Therefore, we encourage regions, universities, and companies who have not yet become member of our wonderful space community to apply for membership. I can briefly share with you how you can do it. It's quite easy. You go to our website, nereusregions.eu. So who we are, become a member, then you are able to view some of the benefits of becoming a member, and then you can follow the steps, some of the steps to become a member and get it in touch with us. Our webinar today, the topic of our webinar today is focused on the need for skills on space policy and strategy in Europe. We are all aware that with recent advancements in space policy and the implementation of the EU space strategy for security and defense, it has become imperative to develop a highly skilled workforce that can spearhead Europe's path towards greater autonomy and independence in space. For that, we are very happy to welcome our two very special guests for today and very well-known space experts. Before I introduce the first speaker, I would like to ask from everyone to mute themselves because I hear some noise in the background. Let me see. Thank you very much. Our first speaker today is Miss Simonetta Di Pippo, Dr. Simonetta Di Pippo. I am sure you all know her. She needs no introduction to you. However, I will mention a few highlights of her CV that also made me a great impression. Simonetta is Professor of Practice of Space Economy and Director of Space Economy Evolution. Maybe because we can need to find, okay, I continue, sorry, because there was some noise behind. She is the Professor of Practice of Space Economy and Director of the Space Economy Evolution Lab in Bocconi. She is the author of Space Economy, The New Frontier for Development. From 2014 to 2022, she was the Director of United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. She served as Director of Human Space Flight at the European Space Agency and as a Director of the Observation of the Universo at the Italian Space Agency, and she led the European Space Policy Observatory for the Italian Space Agency in Brussels. She's an astrophysicist by training, and she has a PhD in International Affairs. She's the member of Women in Aerospace. Actually, she was really involved in the development of women in aerospace in Europe. In 2009, she founded Women in Aerospace, and in 2017, she became a United Nations International Gender Champion. In 2008, the International Astronomical Union named an asteroid 21887 Di Pippo in recognition of her contributions to space exploration. She has been included in the Hall of Fame of the International Astronautical Federation and the Japanese government with the Order of the Rising Sun. I don't know how many lives we need to succeed all of these things. Simonetta, I will stop here, and we would be very happy to listen to your views on the need for space policy skills, drawing from political or social sciences, including international relations, political geography, sociologists, as well as economists, especially now with the launch of many European and other policies related to space. I will share for you the presentation. Give me one moment.
Thank you, Margarita. In the meantime, I mean, I'm really happy to be here with you, and also for sharing my presentation. To be very honest with you, I could talk ages about this very interesting topic. But you know, when you see that I'm running out of time, please send me when 5 minutes before. Send me a sign so that I know
I
that I
am
can.
here. I am here for that. Don't
Thank you
worry.
so much, Margarita. Thank you. So,
Please.
okay, what I'll try to do is really to give quite a broad perspective on space economy, but in particular on the commercial side, and also new technologies in the link with defense, and all of this, the integration of all these elements, how they are tackling the future policy challenges. So, please, the next one. We can skip the next three. They will stay with you. Is the let's say the agenda, what is included. So it's the content, the table of content. So we can probably skip the. But you see, it's well structured, so you know in the presentation where you go for further consultation. And as I said, I'll go through the various topics. So the first point is that allow me to really give you a brief overview of what the Space Economy Evolution Lab is doing, because this is strictly related to what we're talking about here. So this lab was created indeed in 2018. Um, uh, and this was a combination of ideas from a professor of economy, so Mariba, and a quite a famous worldwide astrophysicist, Professor Bignami. So the idea was really to try to develop a cross-cutting research center able to work on really forward-looking topics in the field of space economy. And so I joined this very interesting challenge just last year after I left for the UN after 8 years of service, as Margarita was saying. And so next one, please. What I've been doing is really to restructure this lab and trying to, okay, this one can be skipped because it's the list more or less of the things I did. This one, thank you. This one is really quite interesting because what we are trying to do here is really to develop interesting researches on state-of-the-art topics. And so in order to do that, together with our members and partners, we want to generate new ideas, out of the box ideas. And so we have, for example, this Titan Brain Trust, which is a sort of a closed think tank where members and partners can join. For example, we had last year our first Titan Brain Trust, and the main, let's say, the main expert invited was Pamela Roy. Pamela Roy is the number 2 at NASA. They said the deputy NASA administrator, but she has been also a shuttle commander and so NASA astronaut and a former Air Force pilot. So just to say that she is really one of the top experts in the world, and so this is very appreciated by our members because this can generate a lot of very interesting ideas. Another interesting, I'm not going through everything because in any case, if you want, you can get access to this. But one new feature that I introduced is the sea data. This is extremely important also for trying to understand what is really happening in space economy in Europe and not only. So this is a new database. One of the issues is that when you consider space economy, you have to refer to the OECD definition. However, the OECD definition is simple in a way, is the space sector. So space economy is the space sector plus all the value created by the use of space-based data and infrastructures for the benefit of everyone, everywhere, which means how we use space for us, I mean, for the citizens all over the world. But it's very difficult to categorize what is outside the classical space sector. And so there is a huge effort that has to be done, and we are really tackling this challenge and trying to develop a database which may be helpful for everyone, including all the members of NEREUS and all the ones who really want to understand a little bit more deeper what is really going on in space economy. Next one, please. Okay, very rapidly, here you see our partners, and you see also that they go from the United States to Japan, uh, through the Middle East. And they are research centers and universities, NGOs, IGOs, etc. So these are based on no exchange of funds and are mainly related to topics that are of interest for the lab. Next one, please. And these are the members that we have right now. But as I said, it's just 1 year that I became the director, so is going quite well. This is the new parterre that we have right now, and as you can see, are quite top level companies in the field. But what we want to do now is also to expand to non-space company, because the future of the space economy is there. So how non-space companies can benefit with new markets and new developments in the space sector. So moving, let's say, a little bit beyond the normal boundaries they have and trying to develop new markets. Next one, please. So why is so important to develop new markets? So why commercial markets are can be really a push for policy development? That's the topic here. So very briefly, as I said, space economy as defined by OECD is really the full range and use of resources that create value and benefits for us, I mean, for the citizens. So space economy is really growing and evolving, and you see a lot of, let's say, figures here and there. The most stable and solid, I would say, figure is the one published by the Space Foundation, which is an important NGO, important, let's say, institution in the United States. They publish the report. They publish every year report. The last number, the last figure tell us that it's $469 billion, the current value of the space economy. You may see other and different numbers around. What is absolutely clear is that everyone is in agreement with the fact that a space economy is really, let's say, growing fast, and that by 2040 we will have what is called a trillion economy. So in reality, 1 billion more or less here doesn't make any big any big meaning, I would say. What counts is really the trend that we are witnessing. And now here, just for quickly, what I put together is, you know, short, medium, and long term. In space activities, you always have to look with the vision on the long term. So what you want to do on the long term, and at the same time, trying really to implement new technologies, new initiatives on the short, medium term. So the two things have to go in parallel, because it depends on the kind of application and the kinds of activity you want to develop. So you need always to have this flexible mind and trying to put together all the elements. And so here you see, for example, we go from navigation, Earth observation, and telecom, which are the standard main three technologies which are with us. I mean, hundreds of time. I always ask the question when I have kids, I mean, or teaching somewhere, do you know how many satellites each of us is using every single day? Well, there are hundreds and hundreds of satellites, but we are not, no, we yes, but you know, in general, this is not something that is so well perceived. And so the integration of these three technologies is really helping us for a lot of different, let's say, services that we receive, right? Support that we receive. On the medium term, we see commercial space stations, which are really blooming, in particular in the United States, on-orbit logistics, because the more we build infrastructures in space, the more we need, I mean, to support this infrastructure. And then another emerging field, which is the one of this solar-based, I mean, space-based solar power, where the technology still needs a bit of let's say, refinement, but in particular when you have not to collect, solar energy in orbit, but in particular then when you have to transfer this energy from space to the Earth. And then on the long term, even if we will see that this is not so long term, lunar exploration. And so several countries are preparing themselves to have people living and working on a permanent basis on the surface of the moon. So we will see what this will bring us in terms of new markets. Please.
You can continue. There is an issue with the screen, but
Yeah, you cannot go ahead.
yes, I will stop and I will share again, but you can continue in
Yeah,
the meantime.
yeah, and
Sorry.
so also what I can say is that there is an increasing number of players that they want really to be on the scene, and in particular the fact that there is an interest from private investors, and this is true in particular when we talk about the United States. So there is a bit of how can I say, increasing interest also in other areas of the, I mean, regions on the surface of the planet. But the United States are a little bit ahead. So that's the reason why I'm also making some comparisons. And this is a slide that we prepared here in Milan, where we wanted to show, and this is part of of a research that we are doing, how in the United States, all the elements, and I'm not going through, I mean, if you want that, you can do it, but is really showing how the different elements of the puzzle are really connected together. So having an overarching structure and strategy helps then the United States also to support the companies, the private companies, which really want to invest. And also the way in which, I mean, the public entities, in particular NASA, but not only in the United States, are investing and are dealing with private companies for certain number of initiatives, is really supporting the development of the space economy. So again, this is, we could do the same in Europe, but for the time being, what I can tell you is that it's a little bit more fragmented, and I would say atomized is probably a little bit too much. So that's the reason why I said fragmented. And there are also a lot of overlaps in the various organizations. So probably as a general suggestion, but I'm not the first one saying that. So just say, as we say in Latin, ad abundantiam, is the fact that if you have a very well structured strategy, then you can really support your economy in a better manner. So you are more efficient as a country, and you are more, quick in reaching results. The next one, please. Um, One of the interesting things is that if you look at the situation in the past few years, and how the budgets have been increasing, and also what is really important is to see the distribution in the various fields. So you have, for example, in in 2021, the value of the space sector. So this is not the overall space economy value, but is the space sector value. And you see that the main elements are government space budget, so public money, commercial satellites and launches, so companies that really do that on a commercial basis, then ground station and equipment, which is absolutely mandatory if you want to run a space mission, and then the space products and services, so all the activities, the economic activities of the various companies selling space enabled products and services. So you have the downstream and the upstream, but in this manner I wanted to underline the fact that really the space budget is high, but there's more and more, in a way, getting reduced with respect to the overall amount of money that private investors are putting on the table. Again, this is the United States, and we could derive some lesson learned, best practices, and also see how this can be, in a way, transported, or I don't want to say you cannot do it one to one, because the situation in Europe is different, and also we have really a certain number of countries in Europe which are very top level in the space field, and as I said, also from the governance standpoint, it needs a little bit of refinement in Europe, but still this may be used as a benchmark for future initiatives in Europe. So when we talk about present and future policy challenges, one, for example, we have plenty of them, but one may be the space data use. We know well that, for example, Copernicus, the European Earth observation constellation, when it was approved, there was a huge debate in Europe if we had to go for open and free data access or not. And it was decided at that time, in my opinion, absolutely it was a great idea, or let's say conclusion of the discussion, that we really had to go for an open and free data access. However, you need to have quite strong skills in order to be able to, let's say, extract the features you need from the raw data that you get. So also in that case, you need a lot of expertise. Now, the data that you get from Copernicus are not the ones already fully, let's say, structured and managed so that you have the final product. You really need to extract yourself the features you need. In any case, if we look at the global commercial revenue linked to space, this is more than 15 times the revenues of launchers and satellite manufacturing. Okay, this is something that you can find on ESA documents. So again, as I mentioned before, Morgan Stanley, but not only, a lot of other analysts are really telling us that the space economy will be able to generate revenues of, let's say, trillions. Again, it's really a very rough estimation, because if we don't know exactly what we can include in under the umbrella of space economy in terms of value today, and we don't have a let's say, an agreed and common categorization of what we have to include in space economy on top the space sector itself, well, and the current values are for sure underestimated. That's the reason why Morgan Stanley, for example, but not only them, they say 1 trillion or more. One could say, okay, you could say, okay, it's generic. No, it's not generic. It's the fact that for sure will be something close to 1 trillion, but we are quite confident that it can be far more than that, based on the data we have today. In addition, we have to say that there are several areas of the space industry um, that the companies are really willing to pay for services or information. And so, since this may become quite expensive at a certain point in time, and in particular, if you are an industry that makes use a lot of this kind of, let's say, supports, well, these companies have shifted their approach, and they're therefore starting to participate in the co-development and the co-funding of space projects because they see a real advantage on that. Clearly, Earth observation is a blooming sector, and for example, one important data that is derived from the approach that European Union used with Copernicus. For example, you see here that there is an increase of commercial VHR data, which is an increase by 80%, so 80% by 2027. So it's really a huge number. The next one, please. But also I wanted to make reference to a statement made by Joseph Ashbacher, the Director General of the European Space Agency, who mentioned that the commercialization of European space activities will only succeed with the help of the European Space Agency. Well, this is true, but it's not only the European Space Agency which can contribute to this, because we have also the EUSPA, so the European Commission Space, I mean the European Union Agency for Space Program, but we have also some other entities in Europe, and then the national space agencies, which are also doing a great job. So, as I said before, in Europe, we have quite a certain number of institutions working more or less in the same direction, which is quite good. Next one. Well, when we talk instead of, for example, space debris and orbital sustainability, which is another important topic that the European Union and the European Commission are both tackling very well, to my taste, in this very moment. So we are quite aware of the fact that the more we launch, the more we collect debris. And so that the orbits, in particular the orbits in the low Earth orbit LEO area, are increasing. It's true that we have some mitigations guidelines in place, but it's also true that there is no law enforcement. So in a way, the number of satellites is growing, and we don't have still we are working on new technologies, for example, for active debris removal, but we are not yet there. So we have to look at the how we can maintain the space environment safe, secure, and sustainable, which is really mandatory, in particular, to develop the space economy, the type of space economy that we would like to see. The next one, please. Okay, briefly, you know that there is this Kessler syndrome, which means that if we really don't control what is happening, and if we don't put a bit of, uh, management of the traffic in space, we may soon, hopefully never, but we may encounter this domino effect. We may really in a very difficult situation, up to the point that at least the orbits in low Earth orbits in this area may become really too congested, and therefore it may be a problem even in launching and managing assets in space. Next one, please. There are, as I said, mitigation guidelines approved back in 2007 in the UN for debris, and also in 2019 the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space approved 21 guidelines, and space debris are included. There is nothing on active debris removal, and technologies are under development in several spacefaring countries. So we are getting there, but there is no regulatory framework on that. And also the concept of space traffic management is becoming more and more popular, I would say, for sure, and I'm very happy for that, under the umbrella of the European Union, because European Union is really considering very seriously this issue. Well, in what we were talking about when I was at the UN, and this continues in the same manner, is that instead of talking about space traffic management, we were more talking about space traffic coordination, so that the various countries can maintain the full responsibility of what they do. And then the idea is to have an overarching organization, which is able then to, let's say, coordinate the traffic. And I believe this is a way for member states to be more confident that that their own assets are not touched by others, but at the same time there is someone who is able to coordinate what is happening. Please, next one. Okay, this again, we can skip it. You can find everything on the UNUSA website, so the Office for Outer Space Affairs. This is just for your reference. But clearly, when you talk about peaceful uses of outer space, international relations and international coordination is key. Let's next one, please. And you know that the 10th of October 1967, we had the signature of the Outer Space Treaty. The Outer Space Treaty remains one of the foundation for international space law. However, there are a lot of discussions ongoing about the fact, is this treaty still in line with the requirements and the new situation, the new scenario that we have to deal with now, with asteroid mining and I don't know, outposts on the moon, or cities on Mars, or whatever. So this is really quite an interesting debate at international level in the multilateral framework of the UN, and not only, because, as I said, the European Union is really engaged in this kind of discussion. And again, I like that a lot, because in particular recently, the European Union has been able to publish very interesting documents and directives, which will help the main spacefaring countries, but not only in Europe, to develop their own activities. The next one, please. Okay, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space is currently made by more than 100 members and growing. And counting, and this is very good, because it means that not only the spacefaring countries, but also the developing and emerging countries are considering more and more important space as a topic for their activities. Next one, please. And I just want to take 1 minute to mention that even if we are in a very difficult geopolitical situation right now, and we know why, I don't have to underline the importance in the, let's say, the seriousness of the events we are witnessing every day in Ukraine. However, space may be, again, considered as a sort of platform for diplomacy. And one example here is that for the International Space Station, which is this big lab, which is orbiting 400 kilometers above our heads, well, what you see here is that the Russians and the Americans are really working together to try to operate, the space station as normal. And in this specific case, there is an issue on one of the Soyuz, which is sort of a lifeboat for part of the astronauts. The Soyuz can only bring 3 people back on Earth. There were 2 on the space station. One got the problem. So NASA and Roscosmos, so the Russians and the Americans, have been discussing, and at the very end, they decided jointly that the rescue mission will be under the responsibility of the Russians. And so this is how things may go ahead in space, and again, is a sort of example of how preventive diplomacy can be extremely important to, let's say, tackle issues on Earth that may seem difficult and quite impossible to solve. Next one, please. Briefly, if you allow me, probably this part, even if I'm running out of time, this
3
part...
more minutes. You still have 3 minutes, Simonetta.
Okay, So this part, probably, if you don't mind, I would really mention it because I'm quite fascinated by the documents that the European Parliament and the Council issued together on the 10th of March. So the space strategy for security and defense. The next one, please. And what I see extremely important is that this was already there. I mean, with the creation of the DG DEFIS. So the fact that we're putting together the industry for defense and space, because at the very end we have a lot of dual use technologies. So I believe this is quite a good approach. And in any case, the document, if you didn't read it yet, do it, because it's really a masterpiece in terms of policy, international collaboration, and coordination between, and say, instructions or suggestions on how the various entities under the umbrella of the European Union should work together for the benefit of European citizens. So please, the next one. Okay, that's the strategic components, but can go ahead. One point that I consider extremely important is the fact that there is this idea of establishing an information sharing and analysis center. Well, whatever you do, the best is really to share data, because the more we share, the more we put together various sources of information, the more the decision and policymakers can take informed decisions. So it's really important for the citizens that these kind of actions are taken by the policymakers in Europe to allow us, as the normal citizens, to get access and to get the best service possible from the money that at the very end we all, the taxpayers, contribute with. And here, and then if you want to, we can stop, even if the presentation is far longer. But here, that I wanted to give you a let's say, European Union perspective, and trying to underline the fact that in the United States, we are really witnessing a second change in really radical change in approach. So NASA, the public, let's say, entity in space, was really funding most of the activities. Okay. Then at a certain point in time, when technologies become mature, in particular in the case of accessing space, a low Earth orbit with space station, they decided to move towards, instead of really financing the development of new systems, partially financing the development, but in particular working more on ensuring the operational services. And see, this was the first step towards a new space economy. I mean, a new wave of space economy, where the public money is going more in terms of, I mean, it's going to pay services instead of the development of the system. Now, but still, the instructions, the strategic guidelines were under the responsibility of the government. Now, for example, SpaceX, the company of Elon Musk, is developing Starlink. They have already 4,500 satellites in orbit, which is a constellation fully private, which is needed to connect everyone everywhere in the world. Well, this is done completely independently. And on top of that, now what we see, that there is a derivation of Starlink just announced a few months ago called Starshield, which is another constellation put at the disposal of the Department of Defense in the United States. So the Department of Defense is going to pay for the service, not for the development of the system. And this never happened before. So it's the commercial sector that is going ahead a little bit further and providing the service for strategic needs of the public system in the US. So this may be something which you want to elaborate a little bit more for the future. And I believe, as I said, even if I could talk for ages, this may be the end of my presentation. Thank you. Margarita.
Thank you very much, Simonetta. Thank you for your insightful presentation and all the new points you mentioned in your presentation. I was myself not aware of many parts of the presentation. Very interesting. I have also many questions to you, but I will try to be short also from my side. The audience, also please free from the audience to pose your questions in the chat. Till we have questions from the audience, I would like to ask a question from my side. You highlighted you touched upon many policy issues. And in that perspective, what kind of skills are needed for the current and new generation to have a responsible, safe, and sustainable development of the space sector, in particular now that the private space sector is at the forefront, uh, and how this generation can address key challenges. Just a few words from your side.
Sorry, I was muted.
You were
Well, I believe that there are a lot of challenges, but to my taste, when you have a challenge, and in particular when the challenge is, global, because at the very end, what I've been talking about is really how to tackle challenges that are for the entire humanity, right? And if you take an action here, then this has an impact on other citizens on the other side of the planet. Now, this is interesting because it means, first of all, that we need international cooperation. Second, that we need a common ground in terms of even of words that we use to define X, Y, Z, right? So we do need to have a common understanding of what we want to do collectively as humanity. Now, if we go together to the moon, assuming that we are able to do that, and for example, the Artemis Accords and the program and the Artemis initiative led by the United States, but currently we have other 23 countries which have been already, associated with it, and few of them are European.
Yes.
Well, this may become also for the young students, for the next generations, a sort of, it could give you a sort of sense of purpose, trying really to understand how technology can help us in tackling certain challenges. And one example is climate change. For example, WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, established a few years ago that we have to monitor 54 essential climate variables if we want to understand what is happening with climate and therefore what we have to do in terms of mitigation and adaptation. Okay, we do need to understand what's happening. So science at the center, space at the center. Why? Because out of the 54 essential climate variables, more than half can only be monitored precisely from space. So you understand that without space, you cannot take any a good policy decision. And this is really, really interesting to try also to engage the public and the young generations to understand that space is the future. So we are not just going ahead without a future. No, we have a future. It is in our hands.
Thank you very much, Simonetta. And now I'm tempted to ask also my second question, because part of your presentation included an international aspect on that. We see a growing interest in space applications, also in many African states. Are you optimistic that we are seeing the gap regarding skills closing between developed and developing countries?
Well, I mean, two things. The first one, I strongly believe, I strongly believe that, in particular for emerging and developing countries, but not only, if they want really to be part of this multilateral discussion, well, they do need to grow in certain fields. Now, clearly, you cannot have in a country that never had a space program, quickly they can probably launch I don't know, a CubeSat or they can start using GNSS data or Earth observation data to improve a little bit the quality of life of their citizens. But what they need to do is really step by step to gain a little bit more, let's say, knowledge and master, for example, the development of certain instruments or components. Why? Because when you have to cooperate, you need to have at least a common ground in technical terms, because otherwise one is leading and the other one is following. Well, it will always be true when you have a big country like the United States and others. That's absolutely true. But at the same time, if you are confident that in certain fields you can do something that is, quite special, or even if it's a very small niche, well, the coordination and the collaboration is better. Is good. One of the things that I was mentioning before, that the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space is now more than 100 members. When I joined in 2014, the members were 76. Now more than 100. It means that in just few years we have an increase of about 35%, which for a committee that was created in 58, it means a lot. It means that it was stable and more or less, let's say, in a sleep mode for a certain number of years. And now, for a lot of different reasons, a lot of countries decided that it was the right time to enter into these multilateral discussions. So this is a very good sign, and I'm very positive. Clearly, we have to do a lot of capacity building. Europe is doing a lot also
Raising
in capacity
awareness,
building.
yes.
So let's go ahead.
Thank you very much, Simonetta, and please stay with us to continue the discussion also with Bleddyn. Now, I have the pleasure to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Bleddyn Bowen, who is an Associate Professor of International Relations at the University of Leicester. The University of Leicester and the region are NEREUS members. Just to make a note here. Dr. Bowen is specialized in space policy and warfare, the military uses of outer space and strategic thought. He is an internationally recognized author of the book Original Sin, Power, Technology and War in Outer Space. It was published in 2022, as well as War in Space, Strategy, Space Powers and Geopolitics in 2020. He has advised on space policy and strategy for institutions, including the UK Parliament and Government, the European Space Agency, the Pentagon, and US government. Bleddyn, given your research and work experience, can you highlight to us a few points on understanding space warfare and strategy as part of space policy skills? Please, sir, you can share your presentation.
Yeah, sure. Hopefully you can see that.
Yes.
Okay, thanks very much. So yeah, just some slides really on hopefully showing why and how the humanities and social sciences are particularly useful and also necessary for doing things in space and having a space age and hopefully doing things better. And Simonetta's discussion earlier set up sort of a great wider context to that. And in my own teaching here at the University of Leicester, I often start with asking students, what is space policy? And also relatedly, what is a space agency? And we end up with all sorts of ideas and definitions of what those are. And this, in a nutshell, shows how, if you're interested in the more human dimensions of outer space, and in particular on policy, you can focus on all sorts of areas, from my own field in terms of military intelligence and security, into international governance aspects, which Simonetta knows a lot more than me about, and also science and technology policy, which maybe many people here are already very familiar with, especially if you're from the STEM backgrounds, but also on industrial strategy, which, again, we've heard a lot already this morning, global trade and regulations, another particular focus for the European Union, and all these issues and all these policy areas and the vast ecosystem of space agencies, military, civil, commercial, non-governmental, etc. They all need cross-disciplinary expertise and insights, because everything they do touches on a lot of different facets of activity and the human experience. So space is not just for people from STEM backgrounds, and also if you are in space from a STEM background, then there's a lot that you can gain from engaging with the non-STEM world and non-STEM research on outer space as well. So there is that clear need for policy, political, and historical expertise in space as well. So space things in space don't happen in a political vacuum or a historical vacuum. Our space age is about 70 years old now. But looking at a lot of literature in my field, in international relations and security studies, and also political science more broadly, you'd possibly not notice that we are living in a space age. And that's a sort of a problem in the field I'm trying to address book by book. But in my own field, coming from the sort of the war studies and international security perspectives, there's a lot to be gained by engaging more with the realities of outer space as a normal political environment. It's very much business as usual in space as it is on Earth. But more practically speaking, for those working in the space sector, all space projects have human, political, and social dimensions. They're not just technological projects or technological hobby horses. Even the more fantastical projects like space-based solar power, there are very important political, societal, security considerations and implications with all those, and they rarely feature in a lot of the public communications I've seen to date. So we need people with the larger perspectives on politics, society, and history, and security, and all those other aspects to factor into discussions on all sorts of space policy and projects. And that's as true within the security and diplomatic sphere as it is in perhaps the more engineering and scientific projects on space. So if you look at any large telescope project, there are all sorts of community relations work and local politics work that has to go into it. And some observation facilities really do have particular issues with local politics and indigenous politics as well. And that requires political knowledge and historical understanding to try and resolve amicably, for example. So political research skills and understanding and knowledge are required to scrutinize projects, to better communicate them and justify them, and also evaluate the projects and the values, the social values of all projects as well. In terms of the bigger picture, international relations, Europe and space, the way I try to approach it, again, is that space power or space technologies that states pursue for various reasons, they can be categorized into purposes of war or national security and defense, development and prestige. And most projects, large projects in particular, have two at least of these factors at play. And I'm sure everyone here can see the prestige value of a lot of space exploration projects at the moment. But as we were hearing earlier this morning, economic development now is a very significant part of the increasing international involvement of many countries in the space economy. But one factor that's come from my research on space warfare and military space activities is that the reality that space has always been a militarized environment, Earth orbit in particular, is sort of a starting point for our political understanding of space that is often not quite registering in a lot of space communities around the world, and also the general public as well. So there is that very science-centric perspective of space that is perhaps not warranted when the realities of the military origins of space technologies and the continuing military industrial interest in space to pursue technologies for the purposes of war, national security and defense needs really are still driving a lot of space investments and services. So even with companies of SpaceX, yes, they're doing a lot more, but they are still chasing contracts from the US government and often for military needs as well. So space really is part of the wider technological competition for economic and industrial returns, just like any other high technology sector in world politics now. So I'm sorry to say that space is not special in that regard. If we start seeing it as just another high technology industry, I think a lot more of the bigger picture of what's going on in space makes better sense and hopefully allows us to target our activities and interests there better. And not to be negative about space and politics, cooperation in space is still a political thing. So politics in space doesn't just mean the bad things or the things we don't maybe quite like or wish we didn't have to do. Cooperation in space is something that happens because of politics as well, not despite politics. So you can't just have a space project or do something and think, oh, well, let's not get the politics involved. Let's just try and work together. Working together is still politics. Politics is the process of finding areas to cooperate as well as dealing with the consequences of not being able to cooperate or even competing. And coming back to the European sector, as Simonetta was talking about, Europe is in a particularly challenging place in the years to come as the traditional US dominance of the space economy is now being matched or caught up to by China, because China is investing a lot on a scale that Europe isn't currently matching. So whilst there's a lot of potential in Europe, there's not the same sort of singular focus that the US and China can bring, as they are sort of singular states, and Europe is more of a patchwork of networks and various institutions and states as well. So the EU and ESA space strategies and policy documents, as we've sort of already heard, they're suffused with really important political concepts: sovereignty, autonomy, independence, independent access, things like that. They are supreme political and strategic concepts, and that shows why we need people to engage with the political and social worlds of space security. So we'll see in the years to come whether Europe collectively manages to realise the big game that European leaders are currently talking about in space. And then to bring it from our perspective, and just to try and communicate what we're doing here in the English East Midlands region here as NEREUS members. The space economy, as you know, was diverse. The pie chart we got earlier from Simonetta, I think, summed it up really well. So the dominant bits of that pie chart in terms of space services and applications, that is a massive focus, really, of the sectors of the space economy that we're doing here in the English East Midlands. And in the United Kingdom alone, some estimates show that there's a demand for like 100,000 people in the space sector from all sorts of areas, then in government, industry, private sector, research, universities, etc. So even in just the United Kingdom, the demand for people working in the space sector is huge. But we have to also remember that it's not just for the traditional STEM disciplines we may associate with space, but for everything else that space touches as well, and how space needs inputs from a diversely skilled and diversely knowledge workforce. And across the UK as well, the many local authorities in England are doing things like here in Leicester and the East Midlands, but also in the devolved authorities as well. So the Scottish and Welsh governments have their own space strategies, which dovetailed with the UK national space policies. So in terms of sub-state levels across Europe, they are engaging with space a lot as well. So you don't have to look at the European level or national state levels for civil service work or government relations work. You can look at the sub-state levels or the regions as well, because they have space economies and they need space experts as well. Zooming in maybe even further to Leicester, we have particular strengths here at Leicester, which we are utilising to try and do our part really to create more space education and skills in the sector. At the University of Leicester, and I know there's a colleague of mine in the audience here today, Martin Barstow, who could say much more about the strengths of space physics and astronomy at Leicester than me. But the University of Leicester has had an active instrument in space every year since 1967. And scientists at the School of Physics and Astronomy, Leicester, have had several leading roles in really important science missions such as JUICE, Juno, and Bepi Colombo. For my part of the university, in the School of History, Politics and International Relations, I offer research-led teaching on astropolitics. And as far as I know, we're the only place in the UK that offers undergraduate, postgraduate, and PhD level teaching and supervision in the United Kingdom. I know we also offer professional training on space security and space law, and we also home to the Nuclear Age ERC funded project, the third Nuclear Age project, which looks at a lot of the cross sections between nuclear, missile, and space technologies, all feeding into wider discourse, training, and knowledge exchange on these very important technological and policy and political sectors. We also have expertise in our Leicester Law School, where we have an increasing amount of space law modules being offered as well. So there's a lot going on, even just in one snapshot here at our university here in the English East Midlands at Leicester. Also, very recently, we've had massive investments in Leicester as well. So we have the Space Park Leicester, which is a new purpose-built campus and building in the north of the city. Millions of pounds of investments to bring academic research and industry together. So there are industry working alongside researchers in purpose-built labs and workshops on campus. It's a very, very nice, swish, modern building. I always take any excuse to go and visit it. We are supporting, regional East Midlands economic drives as well. There's some industrial partners and government partners already housed in the buildings as well. And in 2023, Leicester announced its Space City ambition of trying to be recognised as a space city in the UK, and with much more investment to expand the space research cluster, but including wider social sciences and humanities now in the process as well, not just the more traditional STEM and sort of engineering industry as well. So hopefully that's given you a snapshot of why social sciences and humanities are so important in space and are needed and also useful to people already in it, and what's going on in the English East Midlands as well. So I'm very, very much looking forward to the questions, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Bleddyn. Thank you very much for your exciting presentation and for presenting the Space Center in Leicester. Before I engage Simonetta to the discussion, I would like to ask a question to you, given your academic experience. You see that there is a new generation of space policy experts like you, like Ms. Dr. Lieberman at Canterbury University, Dr. Styrikos, the London School of Economics, that you have all a background in politics and international relations. Based on that, what do you think this brings to space skills training?
So what I think it brings is just as it would to any large sort of technologically dominated field, is just understanding the wider social context that all of these projects live within, and understanding often the many practical rationales for investments in these projects that may not feature as strongly in the way that more applied and practical approaches would, especially if you are seeking funding. Then you're not necessarily always going to question or want to analyze the politics of funding, but I think it's part of having that wider discussion, but also being the way into a really important environment that is often seen as, well, I'm not very good in the sciences, therefore space isn't for me. And what I hope that those of us who are coming through now in our fields, and this is one of the things that we're trying to do in the new Astropolitics working group, which I've set up with the British International Studies Association, is to try and be that way in for people with the politics and security and social sciences expertise to get into these, because if space is for all of society, then all of society has to be involved, or at least understand what's going on, and this is the way to do it. Because not everyone is interested in just the scientific questions. Not everyone is interested in how they got a particular piece of satellite radio communications to work. I mean, I'm not that interested in those aspects, but I'm interested in the larger existential questions of why are we doing these things? And then
translate it.
Yeah, translate it. Why do they matter? What does it mean for the rest of us? Because there are now 6,500 active satellites in space. You need people who understand politics and society and history to tell everyone, well, what are the impacts of these? Are they good? Are they bad? Or are they good for some, they're bad for others? How do we mitigate the bad impacts? Or are there things we need to do to change things? And unfortunately, in my book, Original Sin, there are many, many instances where scientific and technological projects have had many negative societal impacts because they just weren't part of the planning and consideration and discussion, because it was dominated by only the scientific and engineering requirements of the project. Asif Siddiqui in New York has done fantastic work on the San Marco project and looking at the impact of that project on Malindi in Kenya itself, and how that technocentric project made no effort to engage the local communities and address that. Thankfully that approach has changed, and ESA has a much more constructive relationship with Kenya today. But back in the 1960s, that wasn't the case. So it's bringing those wider societal perspectives, because science and technologies are still human products, they're still human things, and they're still ultimately political activities as well.
Thank you very much, Bleddyn. I would like to address a question now to both of you. NEREUS is an organization for regions. We represent regional interests, regions using space. And in the recent years, we noticed the ongoing creation of space strategies launched in European regions. I can quote here the example of the Azores in Portugal, Hesse in Germany, or the case of UK Wales, given that Bleddyn comes from Wales. Now, for our international participants, regions are a level next to the national state, to better explain you the situation. So given this new trend and the growing role of the European regions and the use of space, how do you foresee the role of regions in shaping good practices for a skilled workforce?
Want me to answer first?
Yes, as you wish.
Okay, so well, it's always the same concept in a way. While you have countries and space agencies in the various, let's say, top level bodies establishing, strategies for the country, for example, or for Europe, well, it's also extremely important that then this strategy is, how can I say, goes deeper and linked to the reality of the regions. And I would say sometimes even of the cities. For example, you may have a region in a certain country which sees a high concentration of, I don't know, big companies in space, and other regions which may instead be the host of startups. Okay, so the strategy must be strictly linked with the overarching strategy, but also with the realities, local realities. Otherwise, it doesn't work. The only, let's say, caveat is that you cannot have a regional strategy which is not in line with overarching strategy of the country and of Europe in our case, because otherwise this will be detrimental for the region. So it's better to always be in line and go in very detailed, with a detailed approach, in order to have in the region or in the town that you want to consider a dedicated and focused implementation of the strategy. So I'm absolutely in favor, even on reinforcing what you do at NEREUS. I've always been a fan since I was in Brussels, and I continue to be, because I strongly believe that's the way to go.
Thank you, Simonetta. Bleddyn?
Yeah, thanks. I think, I guess this is one of the things about what's useful about people from maybe social sciences and humanities, is that we can bring examples that aren't to do with space to try and maybe think about ways of doing things in space differently or better. And I think in terms of sub-state legislatures and governments, it's another mechanism to try and get things done. And also a mechanism for people to get involved and make their representations as well, especially if national or state level mechanisms are maybe too big or too cumbersome. So often sub-state governments and legislatures can move faster than others, or be innovative in their legislations or techniques. And try things out and get things done, and that can set precedents. So an area where this was done in, say, for example, I'm not being biased here, but in Wales, they were the first part of the UK to push through a plastic bag ban, for example, or sorry, a plastic bag charge for grocery shopping. And it was shown that, well, this can be done because it became a political football in the British Parliament, but in that case, legislating for England. But in Wales and then in Scotland, it was just done. And it wasn't a problem and eventually got adopted. So there are things like that you can do, and the way that companies can sometimes prefer to work with local authorities, and depending on the situation in place, local authorities can maybe get things done with local planning permission and laws much easier. So that can be a case in a few policy areas in Wales as well. So smaller legislatures can be much more nimble, and in terms of international relations, you can look at the literature on small states in the international system and how they can retune and reconfigure their national economies much faster in response to global shocks or global changes. Iceland being an example there, with the various changes to its national economy since the end of the Cold War. So I think there's a lot of potential there, but of course they're going to be limited in the scale of anything that they do as they are sub-states, unless we're talking about the United States, because the sub-state level in the United States is still huge, and China. But I think on the European level, yeah, there's a lot of potential that you can maybe try and do something there if maybe the national or state level is too slow. So that's where I see a lot of potential wider value from what sub-states may be doing with companies.
Thank you very much for sharing your point of views in this matter. And now we have, I see many questions from the audience coming from students, but also from experts. So I would like to give the floor to the participants. Maybe the first question is more relevant to Simonetta, is addressed actually to Simonetta. It's Sarah Razdignis, and she asks you how can we as engineering students get involved with space economy? What are the getaways? How can we interact with the lab or similar organizations?
Well, there are not so many organizations which are really cross-cutting, because the main point here, that what we are trying to do here is really to underline the fact that if you want to be successful in the space field as part of the future workforce, well, you do need to have vertical experience. For example, engineering is perfect, but at the same time, you need to understand about space law. You need to understand about astropolitics, as was mentioned, space diplomacy, how space can be helpful, for example, to reach the goals of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the regulatory framework, and the economy side. So if you want really to succeed in the space field in the future, you need to have at least quite a broad view of what is happening and how this may be helpful for your career, even if you want to specialize in maintaining, your role as an engineer. And this is true if you are an economist, for example. If you are an astro diplomat, as I was, I have this label, so it's my but it's part of the story. Whatever, you do need to have quite a broad range of views. We are doing this here in Bocconi, but there are also other organizations in Europe. And so you may want to get in touch with us, Sarah, this message for the others, and see if we can help.
Thank you, Simonetta. Another question for both of you, actually. How do you see space science research, astronomy, planetary science, etc., fitting into the short, medium, long-term space policy landscape?
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay.
Shall I
Yes,
answer
please,
that? Yeah.
Bleddyn. Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
thanks. Difficult question, really. I mean, I don't see sort of a massive change in how it's sort of already established and institutionalized in many countries. I think it's much more visible than in the past in terms of general public consciousness.
More
But
transparent. Yeah.
yeah, and transparent, and also it's getting, I think, in terms of my I'm an international relations scholar, so the fact that much more countries are doing much more visible space science projects is good. But then many countries have already been involved in all sorts of important, astronomy and observation with all sorts of telescopes all around the global south, for example, and also being, providing supporting infrastructure for large, US or European or Japanese space exploration and science projects. So I think the greater internationalization is possibly the biggest change that's happening in terms of space science. But other than that, I see more just sort of business as usual. And I think a lot of countries are going to be competing for a lot of the same workforce in terms of the globally, what's the word, mobile workforce as well, because people who work in space sciences, space engineering, tend to be able to find jobs in many different countries. So I think it'll remain to be a good time to be a space STEM graduate, because I don't see funds drying up for that anytime soon.
Okay. Another question coming from one of our members. Space is increasingly geopolitical. In fact, the space collaboration between the US and Russia might seem counterintuitive. Do you think it's just a matter of convenience, or is there something else? Challenging question, Cialunzi. I should have read
No
it
problem in
better.
answering, but if you like.
Yes, please, go first, Simonetta.
Okay. Well, for what I see, clearly, as I said, I had for 8 years quite a good insight of the relationship at various levels between the countries. And sometimes, to be very honest with you, if you work in that environment, not necessarily then, one of the jokes that I always make is that if you've been living in that environment for so long, then you don't trust any more media or what they're telling you through the TV or whatever. So you say, okay, the reality is far different. Okay, so having said that as a joke, which even if it's not necessarily a joke, well, I don't believe, and I fully agree with what was said before. If there is a coordination and collaboration between the Russians and the Americans, for example, for the International Space Station, there are some operational reasons, because otherwise the station doesn't work. So in this case, it's really the interdependence between the two that is in a way driving this approach. Even if I may, in Europe, this interdependence was less, probably less stringent, up to the point that the Europeans, the European Space Agency, decided, for example, not to launch anymore with the Russians the one quite an important mission like ExoMars, injecting 6 years of delay and a huge amount of additional cost for the mission itself. So that's
Yes,
to be
yes,
considered.
yes.
Now, the interdependence was not enough, I don't know. But for sure, I do agree that with what was said, that on top of that, there is a joint view from a political perspective or certain things. Okay, so it's a combination of the two things. But in the case of the International Space Station, is really interdependence. Now, if are we able to translate this to the exploration of the moon? I do hope so. Otherwise, considering the current situation, also in terms of missing agreements or missing, let's say, international space law tools, it may become a conflict environment.
Thank you, Simonetta, for your comment. Yes, Bleddyn?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Yeah, I agree with Simonetta that with the ISS in particular, it's very practical reasons, and the consequences and the costs of the loss of the space station was just totally
I
not
think it's
worth
still
it.
2030, right? The contract for
Yeah, and that
ISS.
sort of was sort of the plan really, and yeah, the cost of losing it just didn't sort of just wasn't worth it at all, just for what would be a purely symbolic act of faltering relations. But in the same way that is politics, the ISS was itself a politics of its time as well, and it wasn't an act of altruism from the United States to include the Russians. It was very much practical geopolitical bargaining. So, as part of this International Space Station deal, Russia agreed to not sell cryogenic engine technology to India, which it had previously agreed as a Soviet Union just before the end of the Cold War. It had agreed to become a member of the Missile Technology and Control Regime, so that Russia would not sell its missile and rocket hardware outside of the rules of the MTCR, which was a cornerstone of American missile non-proliferation policy. And then the Americans basically bankrolled Russian Mir shuttle space station activities and then ISS development for the Russians. So the ISS has always been about a lot of practical cooperation with the practical politics behind it, contrary to the very positive symbolism that people have to it. But I think it's worth mentioning as well that that is a very targeted area of cooperation. Whereas in other areas of space activity, you're struggling to get coordination or communication, which is not really cooperation or anything on the scale of the ISS. But countries can still cooperate or communicate and coordinate, and yet still have guns pointed at each other. So that's entirely normal in the political world. So it's not like you have cooperation or competition in space. It's usually a mix of a bit of everything, depending on the areas you're looking at. And again, this is the value of the political perspective, because you're looking at the sea. Well, many countries whose navies have each other as potential enemies and hostiles may still have cooperation in marine science.
Yeah.
So in the same way, you can sort of summarize everything that happens in a single place very easily with with sort of top level words. So specific areas of cooperation and communication doesn't mean that they're not ready to start shooting each other if it ever becomes possible or necessary in the views of political leadership.
Thank you, Bleddyn. One last question, but very important. It comes from Ilva Carbonaro from GSEC. She asks, isn't it a bit dangerous to leave commercial companies like SpaceX provide the infrastructure, for example, satellites constellations, for the services needed for public interest? Can it give the private sector a kind of control on the provision of public services? Very nice question.
Well, the answer is yes. And now I believe you agree. Now we could elaborate
Yes, it's
for
a full
ages,
sentence.
but the answer is yes.
As an academic, I would say it depends. It depends on your domestic legislation and whether, if there's a company behaving badly, does your state have the laws to enforce or punish such bad behavior? Or is there political will to actually go after the private sector if it starts threatening core areas of economic policy, security, and foreign policy? In the United States, the private sector has always been very important in providing essential services. So before SpaceX, it was private companies that built rockets that provided the Pentagon with all their access to space. So United Launch Alliance, which was the monopoly company set up between Boeing and Lockheed, but they are very much part of that military industrial complex. So and with a company like SpaceX, their biggest single customer in everything is the US government. So SpaceX has to be very careful that they don't annoy the US government. Maybe Simonetta disagrees, but
no, sorry, no.
And that's the interesting part. It's a debate.
So
Please.
if you're
We
a
can discuss
company,
about that. It's
So
an interesting discussion.
yeah, so if you're a single big company and you have a single big client, then the client is also very important. So there is a relationship, but it's an important question in terms of if we are becoming more dependent on the private sector, how do we govern and regulate that? And those are really important questions.
Simonetta.
Well, it's as I said, it was true until a certain point. But with Starlink and Starshield and Starship, SpaceX is in another. It's at another level. don't forget that Starlink provided 25,000 terminals to Ukraine. Okay, so they did something that we may consider positive, and they did it in agreement with U.S. government. Well, question mark. We may have our, guess about that, but fine. Officially, it was really a commercial activity, and not commercial because at the very end, until from the 24th of February until October, November, when they started to say, okay, we want at least the services paid. Well, everything was provided free of charge, and still they are a commercial company on a constellation, on using a constellation that was completely a private enterprise and nothing to do with public instruction or public strategy. Now, the point is that, as I said, what we were saying before is true up to a certain point. So, for example, for Falcon 9 and Dragon serving the ISS is just a different way of, procuring the services. But with Starlink and with Starship, it's a completely new change. I mean, it's a new approach. And for the time being, SpaceX is in line, and also it's an American company. So I fully agree they have to follow certain rules, but providing the service is a political act, okay? And having the full control of internet at global level is a political act also, because it will give a lot of, leverage. Now, one of the things that I believe about Elon Musk is that whatever he says he will do, at least in space, is doing it. Just today, I saw that he filed a request to FAA to launch again Starship. He will make it. Now he will make it. Now, this means another revolution, and the instructions and the specs were not coming from the US government. So on one side, we have to focus on what is happening, but there is a risk that if you have a similar company developed in another country, not necessarily a friend, this may create a little bit more troubles than the current ones, which are already a lot. So, but I would love to discuss. And by the way, sorry, in the meantime, I bought your book on Kindle. So just while you were
Thank you very
talking.
much. But yeah, there's a lot
just in
more to be
case.
said on that issue, yes.
Cooperation in space and on Earth.
Absolutely, always. The only way to survive.
Okay, thank you very much for your significant input and the very interesting discussion we have. We don't have more time to take more questions, unfortunately. What I would like to say from my side, it's on behalf of NEREUS, I express my sincere gratitude to both of you. We are aware that you both have a very busy schedule. You contributed with your valuable insights to this discussion. I hope to have you again as guests, because we have digital infosession also for defense, security and safety, and education training, of course. So we hope to resume in one of our next webinars with you. In the meantime, I would like to inform you and the audience that our next education training webinar would be on the 20th of June. This is an indicative date, however. I will share with you the link to register. And the topic of the next webinar actually is it's about the interdisciplinarity character of space. Space and artificial intelligence, space and health, space and arts, space and quantum technologies. So we would be happy to see you again. And thank you very much. Thanks a lot to the audience that stayed from the beginning till the end. Thank you, Simonetta. Thank you, Bleddyn. And wish you a very, very nice continuation with your work.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been
Bye.
a pleasure. Bye.